Imagine being forced to become Queen of England when you're still a teenager, only to lose your head on the executioner's block before your 18th birthday. Picture a brilliant young woman who never wanted power, manipulated by ambitious adults into accepting a crown that would become her death sentence within just 9 days. This is the tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the most reluctant monarch in English history, whose brief reign became one of the most heartbreaking examples of how children can become casualties in the deadly game of Tudor politics. What happened to Jane wasn't just regicide, it was the calculated murder of an innocent teenager whose only crime was being born into a family ambitious enough to challenge the most dangerous dynasty in Europe. Before we uncover the shortest and most tragic reign in English history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because Jane Grey's story proves that sometimes being royal is the most dangerous thing you can be. Lady Jane Grey never stood a chance at surviving the political machinations that surrounded her from birth, as ambitious relatives and ruthless nobles saw her royal blood not as a birthright to be protected, but as a weapon to be wielded in their quest for ultimate power. Born in October 1537, Jane entered a world where her value as Henry VIII's great-niece made her simultaneously precious and expendable, a living chess piece in the deadly game of Tudor succession. Jane's parents, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon, viewed their daughter's intellectual gifts and royal lineage as political assets rather than personal qualities to be nurtured. From earliest childhood, Jane was subjected to an educational regime so intensive that it bordered on abuse, designed to create the perfect Protestant queen rather than a happy child. Her tutors included some of Europe's most distinguished scholars, but their instruction came with beatings, starvation, and emotional manipulation that left deep psychological scars. The young Lady Jane's daily routine was a relentless schedule of academic and religious instruction that left no room for normal childhood experiences. She woke before dawn for Latin prayers, spent her mornings translating Greek texts, her afternoons studying theology and philosophy, and her evenings writing letters in multiple languages to European scholars who praised her precocious intelligence. By age 10, Jane could debate complex theological concepts in Latin, write sophisticated political treatises, and engage in philosophical discussions that impressed adult intellectuals. However, Jane's remarkable education came at a terrible personal cost. Her parents treated affection as a reward for academic achievement and withheld love whenever she failed to meet their impossibly high standards. She was beaten for minor errors in translation, starved when her theological arguments weren't sufficiently sophisticated, and emotionally manipulated through constant comparisons to other royal children who had disappointed their families. Jane's relationship with her cousin, the future King Edward VI, provided her only glimpse of normal royal life and genuine affection. Edward, just 3 months younger than Jane, shared her love of learning and Protestant faith, and their friendship was one of the few genuine emotional connections in Jane's otherwise controlled existence. Their correspondence reveals two intellectually gifted children finding comfort in each other's company while being shaped into political instruments by the adults around them. The death of Henry VIII in 1547 and Edward's accession to the throne at age 9 created new opportunities for the ambitious nobles who surrounded both children. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, emerged as the most ruthless and capable of these men, gradually consolidating power as Edward's regent while planning a strategy that would use Jane's royal blood to maintain Protestant rule beyond Edward's expected death. Dudley's master plan required controlling Jane completely, which meant arranging her marriage to his youngest son, Guilford Dudley, in a ceremony that took place in May 1553 when Jane was just 15. The marriage was a purely political arrangement designed to give Dudley's family a direct connection to the throne, but it also represented Jane's final loss of any personal autonomy or hope for a normal life. By early 1553, Jane had become the unwitting centerpiece of a conspiracy that would challenge the established succession defy Queen Mary Tudor's legitimate claim to the throne, and ultimately cost her everything, including her life. The death of King Edward VI on July 6, 1553, triggered the most audacious power grab in Tudor history, as John Dudley and his conspirators implemented their plan to bypass Henry VIII's daughters and place 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey on the throne of England. Edward's final weeks had been spent signing documents that altered the succession, excluding his Catholic half-sister Mary and Protestant half-sister Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin Jane. Jane's reaction to learning of her elevation to the throne revealed the fundamental tragedy of her situation. She was genuinely horrified by news that should have been the greatest honor of her life. When informed that Edward had died and named her his successor, Jane fainted and had to be revived with smelling salts. Upon regaining consciousness, she wept and declared that the crown belonged to Mary Tudor by right, begging to be released from a responsibility she felt unworthy to bear. Her pleas were dismissed by the adults who had orchestrated her coronation, including her own parents, who threatened her with physical violence and eternal damnation if she refused to accept God's will. Jane's mother, Lady Frances, told her daughter that rejecting the crown would be both treason against England and sin against God, while her father-in-law, Dudley, made it clear that her entire family's survival depended on her cooperation. Jane's brief reign began on July 10, 1553, when she was proclaimed Queen of England in a ceremony at the Tower of London that she attended with visible reluctance. Witnesses described her as pale and shaking throughout the proceedings, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening to her. She wore the crown jewels that had belonged to her predecessors, but the symbols of royal power seemed to diminish rather than enhance her authority. The political situation deteriorated rapidly as news of Jane's proclamation spread throughout England. Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, had fled to Norfolk, where she began gathering support for her own claim to the throne. The English people, regardless of their religious preferences, recognized Mary as the legitimate heir and rejected Jane as a usurper imposed by ambitious nobles seeking to maintain their power. Jane's attempts to exercise genuine royal authority during her brief reign demonstrated both her intelligence and her complete political isolation. When Dudley pressured her to make her husband Guilford king rather than just prince consort, Jane refused, showing a surprising understanding of constitutional law that impressed even her enemies. She insisted that Parliament had made her queen, and only Parliament could elevate her husband's status. The collapse of Jane's reign came with stunning swiftness as her supporters abandoned her cause in favor of Mary Tudor's more legitimate claim. By July 19th, just 9 days after her proclamation, Jane's own council had declared for Mary, leaving the teenage queen completely abandoned by everyone except her immediate family. Jane's final act as queen was to formally renounce the crown that she had never wanted, expressing relief at being freed from responsibilities that had terrified her from the beginning. However, her abdication would not save her from the consequences of having worn the crown, even briefly and unwillingly. The 9 days queen had become the 9 days prisoner, trapped in the same tower rooms where she had briefly ruled England. Lady Jane Grey's transformation from reluctant queen to condemned prisoner revealed the brutal realities of Tudor justice, as Queen Mary Tudor's government struggled to decide whether mercy or execution would better serve their political needs. At just 16 years old, Jane found herself facing treason charges that carried the death penalty, despite having been manipulated into accepting a crown she had never wanted and ruling for barely over a week. Initially, Mary Tudor showed remarkable restraint toward her teenage cousin, recognizing that Jane had been a victim of adult manipulation rather than a willing usurper. The new queen's advisors were divided on Jane's fate. Some argued that executing a 16-year-old girl would generate sympathy for Protestant causes, while others insisted that leaving any rival claimant alive created dangerous opportunities for future conspiracies. Jane's imprisonment in the Tower of London was initially relatively comfortable, reflecting Mary's inclination toward mercy. She was allowed to keep servants, receive visitors, and maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. Jane spent her days reading religious texts, writing letters to family members, and engaging in theological discussions with scholars who were permitted to visit her cell. The teenager's intellectual gifts remained undiminished by her circumstances, and she used her imprisonment to produce some of the most sophisticated theological writing of her era. Her letters from the tower demonstrated remarkable maturity and spiritual insight for someone so young, as she grappled with questions about divine providence, political responsibility, and the meaning of suffering. However, Jane's comfortable imprisonment became increasingly precarious as political pressures mounted on Mary's government. Protestant conspiracies continued to emerge throughout England, and Jane's very existence as an alternative monarch made her a potential rallying point for religious opposition to Mary's Catholic restoration. The decisive moment came in early 1554 with Wyatt's Rebellion, a Protestant uprising led by Sir Thomas Wyatt that aimed to prevent Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain and potentially restore Protestant rule. Although Jane had no knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy, her existence as an alternative monarch made her symbolically complicit in any Protestant resistance to Mary's government. The rebellion's failure sealed Jane's fate, as Mary's advisors successfully argued that leaving her alive would encourage future conspiracies. The decision to execute Jane was made not because of anything she had done, but because of what she represented, the possibility of Protestant resistance to Catholic rule. Jane's reaction to learning of her death sentence revealed the remarkable courage and spiritual maturity she had developed during her months of imprisonment. Rather than pleading for mercy or expressing bitterness about her fate, she accepted the verdict with dignity and used her remaining time to prepare her soul for death. The final weeks of Jane's life were marked by intense pressure from Catholic priests who attempted to convert her to Catholicism in exchange for possible mercy. These theological debates became Jane's last opportunity to demonstrate the intellectual brilliance that had once made her famous throughout Europe, as she defended Protestant doctrine with a sophistication that impressed even her Catholic interrogators. Jane's refusal to compromise her religious principles for the possibility of saving her life demonstrated a spiritual courage that transformed her from a political victim into a religious martyr, ensuring that her death would inspire rather than discourage Protestant resistance to Mary's rule. Lady Jane Grey's execution on February 12, 1554, transformed a reluctant teenager into one of history's most poignant symbols of innocence, destroyed by political ambition, as she faced death with a dignity and courage that impressed even her enemies and ensured her place in popular memory as the tragic 9 Days Queen. At 17 years old, Jane became the youngest queen in English history to be executed, her death marking both the end of a brief life and the birth of a legend that would endure for centuries. The morning of her execution, Jane maintained the intellectual composure and spiritual strength that had characterized her throughout her imprisonment. She spent her final hours in prayer and religious contemplation, writing letters to her family and preparing a speech that would demonstrate her Protestant faith, while avoiding any statements that might implicate her surviving relatives in treason. Jane's final speech from the scaffold revealed the remarkable transformation she had undergone during her months in the Tower. The terrified 16-year-old who had fainted upon learning of her elevation to the throne had become a composed young woman who faced death with spiritual confidence and intellectual clarity. She acknowledged that accepting the crown had been legally treasonous, while maintaining that she had been manipulated by others and had never desired royal power. The most moving aspect of Jane's final moments was her insistence on maintaining the religious principles that had defined her life, even when conversion to Catholicism might have saved her. She used her scaffold speech to affirm her Protestant faith and express her confidence that death would reunite her with God in heaven, transforming what was supposed to be a humiliating public execution into a powerful testimony of religious conviction. Jane's composure during the actual execution process was extraordinary for someone so young. She submitted to having her eyes blindfolded with perfect dignity, knelt at the block without hesitation, and placed her head in position for the executioner's axe with steady hands. Her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," echoed Christ's last words and reinforced the religious meaning she had given to her death. The execution itself was swift and professional. A single stroke of the axe ended the life of someone who had been Queen of England for 9 days and a prisoner for 7 months. Jane's death eliminated the last serious Protestant claimant to Mary's throne and allowed the Catholic Restoration to proceed without the constant threat of Jane being used as a rallying point for religious opposition. The immediate aftermath of Jane's execution revealed the complex emotions her death generated throughout England. While Mary's supporters celebrated the elimination of a dangerous rival, many English people were troubled by the execution of someone so young who had clearly been manipulated by adults seeking their own advancement. Jane's grave, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, became a site of unofficial pilgrimage for Protestants who viewed her as a martyr for their faith. Her death had achieved the opposite of what Mary's government intended. Instead of discouraging Protestant resistance, it provided them with a powerful symbol of innocence destroyed by Catholic persecution. The 9 Days Queen had become immortal through death, her brief reign and tragic end ensuring that she would be remembered long after the political crisis that killed her had been forgotten. The next time you think being royal guarantees a happy ending, remember Lady Jane Grey, a brilliant teenager who discovered that wearing a crown for 9 days could cost you your head forever. Her story reminds us that innocence is no protection against political ambition, and that sometimes the most tragic figures in history are those who never wanted power in the first place. If this heartbreaking tale of England's most reluctant queen moved you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold stories of royal victims, and hit that notification bell, because the most powerful lessons come from those who pay the ultimate price for other people's ambitions. What other young rulers do you think were destroyed by the adults who should have protected them? Share your thoughts in the comments below.